Today, we're talking about mastering cross-cultural communication. And I am really excited to have these two ladies joining us today who have gone through a lot of experiences in this area and have a lot to share. First, we have Neelam Mohanty. She is a technology leader driving digital transformation at Northwestern Mutual Insurance. She's also a diversity, equity, and inclusion champion, and she has a blog on cultural intelligence. And this blog started ranking #1 on all sorts of terms related to metaphors and idioms. So people were really interested in what she had to say in this blog. She also has a book on Amazon on the same topic, so I'll also link that below. And then Pakala is a senior director in engineering at Northwestern Mutual. She's a woman in technology champion, a mentor in many areas, and an active volunteer for promoting STEM education for girls. She has an MBA for marketing as well and a master's degree in management information systems. So welcome Anu, and welcome Neelam.
Thank you for having us, Ivana.
Yeah, great to be here.
Let's start off with, what cultural challenges have you personally experienced and what did you learn from them?
Sure. This is a topic that Neelam and I have been researching and spreading the word a little bit over the last 2 years. Now, if you asked me 2 years ago, I would have just been silent because a lot of times we experience things and we travel a journey, but we don't sometimes look back and think about, oh, remember how I was 20 years back and how far I've come. So this actually gives us an opportunity to go down memory lane and think about some of the things that we have learned during the process. So the first one that comes to my mind is I was a community college and I was taking a course, and I asked a question, and then I got a really puzzled look from my. Then he moved on, and somebody else asked the question, and they asked the exact same question, and then he answered. And I was in my 20s at that time, and I went back home and I talked to my husband, and I was like, I asked the question, and this my professor gave me such a puzzled look, and then it was the same question, and he answered it. So I just don't know, did I not ask it right? And so then he gave me a tip, and he said, what happens is, though we think we speak the same language, growing up in India, our education is all in English. We speak English in all the offices. So I never thought that my language was any different. But what I quickly came to realize was that though it's the same language, the speed at which I was speaking was very different. So while I was saying the words, the pace of it was so fast that people here were not able to understand me as well as I thought they could understand me. So that was the first cultural difference that I learned, is that though you may speak the same language, just because you are in a different country, the way you say certain things and the speed at which you say it. So that's one thing that the first thing that hit me. The second one is things like phrases that we use. So in my vocabulary, I use a lot of should, and I would get a little bit of a look for that, which later I realized because should sounds very like you have to do it. And that's not what I was. The other one that I've seen, which again, I really had to change so that I can really learn to live life here, was related to food. When I was traveling back in there wasn't as much vegetarian food around. So when you were traveling and you were in any airport, the most common place you would go to is McDonald's, and they didn't have a lot of vegetarian options. I would say I don't want meat, and I would still get a very puzzled look. And again, I would be like, don't want meat. And it's again, huh? And then I learned to say no meat, not don't want meat. Now, you don't think that these two phrases will mean so many different things, or it could make communication so much easier, but they do. Again, just the way you use your words makes a huge difference. The other cultural difference that I remember is, again, just the environment we're in. In India, we don't use a lot of thank yous and excuse me. The politeness factor is a little lower. And as I was living here, I realized that you hear a lot of thank yous and excuse me's, and I wasn't doing it. And then I was perceived a little bit as rude. And then I realized, oh, I need to incorporate some of those. It didn't come naturally to me. But over time, I start incorporating some of those thank yous. Or if you are squeezing past somebody in a line, I would just do that without actually saying, excuse me. And that's again something that here you always hear the word excuse me. So now those are part of my vocabulary. I'll let Neelam go with a few other examples so that I can fit in so that we can hear her side of the story too.
Sure, yeah. Some of the challenges that I encountered in the beginning, one of the big ones was personal space. When I started my first job, or even just in the shopping centers or malls, people would walk past me and say, "Excuse me." In the beginning, it used to puzzle me because I'm like, "Did I touch you? Why are you saying excuse me?" Because in India, you probably know it's the most populous country in the world now. And especially in the metros, there's a lot of people, lots of population. And if you're traveling by a subway or even in a bus, it's inevitable you're pushing and jostling against each other. And even in crowded offices, touching is not as taboo. Right? Versus in America, what I learned was there's this invisible personal space that exists. And so even if you're walking past someone, if you're invading in their personal space, you say, "Excuse me," when you're doing that. Another example of personal space is I'd been here a few years and a colleague who I hadn't seen for a few months just saw me in the cafeteria and came and gave me a hug. And this was a male colleague. And again, cultural differences, right? India, a male colleague would almost never give a female colleague a hug after seeing them for a few years. And so I was taken aback in the beginning and I'm like, okay, what is this? This isn't done. And then now, of course, I give hugs. That's a different story. But those were some of the shockers from a personal space. The other thing was just learning how to deal with hierarchy. So I think Eastern countries like India especially have a more ingrained notion of hierarchy. And so even when we talk to our managers or our leaders, we will call them sir or ma'am. And so just learning to refer to people that are your superiors in the workplace as just by first name, that did not come naturally to me, let alone thinking of building relationships with them in my more junior career years. I would never imagine that I could be the Neelam I am today, where I can seek out a leader, talk to them about a topic, build a relationship just to get to know them and give my opinions and viewpoints on something. In a more hierarchical culture, that's just not done. And then there's other things about personal branding that I was never comfortable with. I still am not, but I understand it's a necessary part of my career development. Because in India, when we were growing up, especially, we're always taught a phrase that you put in the hard work, but you can't control the outcome. And in fact, you're taught to be the values of humility and modesty. And so when you come here and you get feedback during your performance reviews, that you have to make your work visible to others. Personal branding is a way of making your unique differentiators known to others. That was very foreign to me in the beginning. There's others, but I think that gives you a good idea about cultural challenges that I experienced, especially in my beginning years.
Wow. I hear these stories and I can relate to many of them, given I've worked in some different locations, but I can see how a lot of people who might have backgrounds, even if they were born in the US, but their family comes from an Asian culture or from somewhere else, might be experiencing these same challenges without even knowing what's happening, and in feeling confused, feeling misunderstood, and not really understanding that there's actually a cultural difference there. For example, the shoulds, that's something that I actually talk a lot about in assertiveness training, because of that perception that people have, right? Of a should being a pretty aggressive thing to say. And the personal space, the day I arrived, I moved to Dubai in the Middle East. There was a flight that had arrived at the same time, and I came by myself. There's a flight full of Indian men. So there's all these huge queues of Indian men, and I was in the middle of them. And I felt like Brazilians, my nationality is Brazilian, and we tend to have a small personal space, but their personal space was way smaller. And I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I put my luggage behind because I wanted to create more space for myself. So that's so interesting that you shared that. I actually, a lot of those aspects, specifically from India, wasn't aware of, but I can see how that applies to a lot of countries from within Asian background, even Middle East. I think a lot of that would apply. So that is fascinating and great examples.
Yeah, I have one more that I do want to get in because there is a funny story to it. So it's related to, right? We had a team, we had a very close knit team, and one of the team members, I think it was his anniversary or his daughter's birthday, something like that. And so he invited all of us, and he said noon for lunch. So one of my coworkers, she didn't have breakfast either because she really liked Indian food. So she didn't have breakfast, and she was there sharp at noon. And then she goes to this place, and it was one of those in the apartment complexes you have like a party room. So it was in that place, and the room was locked. Like there's nobody there. So she thought maybe she got the wrong address, she got the wrong date. So she called me, and I said, it's noon. And she said, but yeah, but they said noon. I said, yeah, but nobody's going to be there till 1 o'clock. So I had to go back home. Punctuality is one of the other things that you catch on quick, that the same noon doesn't mean the same for different cultures.
Brazilians don't follow the time strictly because that would not be polite.
Exactly. That's how it is in Indian culture. In fact, if an Indian invites us, my kids, when it's whoever invites, depending on their cultural background, is what time we land up at their house.
That's interesting. So this essentially means that it's really important when we're inserting ourselves in a new culture to not only understand a lot of these cultural nuances, but to communicate extensively with the people that we work with, especially if one of these misunderstandings happen, or even just ask for guidance and a lot of feedback so that we come to learn these things before it ends up affecting us and how people perceive us.
Completely agree.
Beautiful. I know that sports metaphors are something that is big, and it's something that you wrote a lot about as well, Neelam. So what kind of sports metaphors did you encounter, and how did you respond to them?
Oh yeah, that's a favorite topic of mine because that's actually how I got started with my blog, right? As I wanted to talk about all the metaphors I'd encountered in my workplace. And I feel like sports metaphors are so heavily sprinkled in the American workplace, and a lot of people unconsciously use them without even realizing they're using a metaphor or it's a sport. So my first one, I think this will crack you up, is always my director, one of my first ones, told me to knock the ball outside the park when talking about a marquee client. And after that meeting, I quietly walked to the corner window and I started searching for this park that everyone but me was obviously very familiar with. I had no idea what ball they were talking about, but I figured I'd start with the park. And looking back, that seems so hilarious, right? And then the second encounter, I remember a colleague telling me that he wanted to take a rain check for a planned lunch that we were going to go for together. And I started looking at the weather and I'm like, okay, maybe there's rain in the forecast, and whatever he's saying has something related to rain. It was perfectly sunny. And I'm like, okay, what is this rain check that he's talking about? Right. And so those were a couple of the common baseball metaphors. When you go to football, right? So by then, I'd been in America for a few years. I at least had the basics of football. I knew what a quarterback was. Now, what I wasn't prepared for is there was another project that went live the weekend before, and my project team was sitting and analyzing all the problems they had with their release, and we were talking about everything they could have done differently. And so our team lead comes along and says, you got to stop your Monday morning quarterbacking and armchair quarterbacking. And those were terms I wasn't familiar with. And when I heard armchair quarterback, I immediately started thinking maybe there's a version of football that's played at your desk. And somehow there's an armchair quarterback who participates in it. So another one with football was when someone told me to make a Hail Mary effort for a project that was running late. And the only phrase I'd heard similar to that was Hail Hitler. And so now I'm thinking maybe that America had a leader similar to Hitler, and the Hail Mary phrase was used in context. Their internet was not as ubiquitous in the days when I came to America, which was about 21 and a half years ago. And even these kind of metaphors were not so easy to find for the first few years. Now, of course, you can just Google them and they come right up and you can figure out the meaning. And then just with boxing, take off your gloves or you're on the ropes. These were things that I'd heard in workplaces, and I eventually got the context in which they were used after the first 2 or 3 times. But I never knew they were boxing metaphors until I actually researched them for my blog and learned their origin. So we could go on, but I think these give a great example of everything that I've encountered with regards to metaphors.
I wouldn't have known any of those either because I'm really not into sports. But is that something that you learned philosophically what those expressions were? Or did you start to engage in sports and watch sports so that you could better understand the context of some of those expressions?
Yeah, so I did understand the basics of baseball and football. So in India, we play cricket, right? So I was familiar with the cricket idioms and how cricket is played. But I started understanding how football and baseball is played, not just for the context of metaphors, but because when you went to work, especially in technology, there are limited women. The guys were always talking about last night's football game or this Rose Bowl. I remember thinking in the beginning what all these bowls were. I had no idea. And they'd be talking about tackles and interference. And you just wanted to at least be able to understand them and not just feel completely left out. And so, yes, I did. Even though I'm not an avid sports follower either, I don't watch a whole lot of sports, but I did at least understand the basics so I could watch the one odd game or participate in conversations without feeling left out.
At least know what they're talking about, even though you didn't necessarily share the same passion as they did for the
Exactly.
topic.
Exactly. Yeah.
I do think it comes down to a combination of both, right? Because as you hear more of these phrases and then you're the one with a puzzled look or you're not actually totally understanding it, I think then over time, then you can figure out the context it's set in. And then as you watch the games, then then the light bulb goes, ah, that's why they said that. And then before you know it, that vocabulary you've built up that muscle because now you're hearing those things often. You can correlate the context in which they're said, and then you also watch the games yourself.
Yeah, it's understanding those analogies enough to engage. And what are some examples of how you've been able to adapt your own communication, your own behavior, especially in the workplace, to new cultures as you've experienced them?
Yeah, I think it goes with some of the awareness that you face, right? So some of the examples that Neelam and I were sharing. So then when we look at that, it starts with, okay, so maybe we have to make some adjustments ourselves, right? Because we're here, we want to integrate, we want to communicate effectively. The bottom line is you want to engage better with your coworkers because that makes you feel better. But then in a workplace setting, you also want to make sure that you're being effective, right? Your communication so that you can achieve those common outcomes. So I think some of the things that I know that I was trying to adjust was from the example I said previously, the speed at which you talk, right? Trying to adjust to that. Now, there were times when I go really slow, so I become like a robot, and then I have to adjust it. I'm going too slow now. I have to go a little fast. But you finally get to a happy place where you feel like, okay, now I can communicate a little more effectively. And then that also increases your confidence. That's really the key, so that you feel confident when you're engaging with others. The other adjustment is really a little bit of what you touched on. It's not only about you learning and adjusting, but really leaning in and asking others to help you. So being vulnerable, sharing with your colleagues. And that's a lot what I did in the beginning few years is really identified who my friends were, right? Who would be empathetic to maybe some of the challenges I was facing, and who would be very generous in sharing that here's what this means, or here's that what that means, or this phrase. Spending some time with them so that you can pick up on some of those nuances. So I would say really leading in and finding your friends and having them help you.
Yeah, I'll add to what Anu said. I think a couple of adjustments that I've done over the years is one is I've learned to give direct feedback, which I wasn't very comfortable, and receive it. Right. Again, I think it's the culture that I grew up in. If you wanted to give hard feedback, a lot of times I used to hint at it, try to say it in flowery language versus being very direct. And I think I've learned that in American culture, direct feedback is appreciated. And so I've learned to give and receive it both and learn to be more assertive and just making that direct eye contact. That was a change for me too. Again, India is a patriarchal country. I'm not sure I would have made such direct eye contact with figures in authority, but now I've definitely learned how to do that and to be more assertive for myself. Just because I was an immigrant and I had to go through my own cultural assimilation journey, it's made me much more empathetic of people in my teams or around me who may be from different cultures, right? So now if I see someone who's from a different culture, I make sure I speak slowly. I ask them if I find some of their gestures might be confusing. I make sure I ask them. I try to understand their culture and give them the same support that some people gave me when I was new to America to help them adjust to the American way of life. And I think it's inevitable, right? Now we're in a global age. And so those people might not just be sitting beside you, but you might be dealing with them remotely. There's so much offshoring going on. And if you work for a global business, then you've got your counterparts in different parts of the world. You just need to know how to communicate with them. And the timeline thing is very important. In the work setting, you might shoot off an email expecting a reply within the same day or within 24 hours. But your counterpart in the other side of the world might not respond immediately, because for them, the priority is getting harmony amongst their stakeholders before they respond. And you might be sitting here thinking, oh my God, their work ethic is poor because they haven't responded to my email in a couple of days. What's going on? So just learning these little nuances of cultural adaptability.
When I moved to UAE, we had a course initially on these cultural differences that we had to take into account for business specifically. And one of them was the importance of really getting personal with people before conducting business. So there was those expectation that once you got into a meeting, you would chit chat about family, about life, and then you might spend the entire meeting chit chatting about random stuff and not even get down to business.
Mm-hmm.
And that you'd need the meeting, maybe the third meeting or the fourth meeting. That's when you would get to business. But when you did get to business, it would be super quick because that trust. So it's interesting that you share a lot of these things, because it brings back some of my own different experiences with the culture aspects, the harmony that's a priority in that culture versus, let's say, here in the US, which is more assertive in like that direct eye contact, direct feedback, speaking at a certain speed and being very clear. I think that's all very, very different and very important to adapt. Did you ever feel like that wasn't you, that you were losing your personality in the process of changing your communication to adapt to a new culture?
And not me. I always tried to make sure that I retain my own identity and my own culture. And you'll notice I'm wearing what is a traditional symbol of a married woman in India. And sometimes people will ask about it. What are you wearing? What is this pendant you've got? But I always tried, they say America is a melting pot, right? So I always tried to maintain my own identity and tell the other person what was special about my culture. An example I'll give you is my name is Neelam, right? And most Indian names have a meaning behind it. And Neelam means a blue sapphire, or it can also be used to refer to the sky in a poetic manner in Hindi. Now, if you pronounce my name Neelam, it means something that can be auctioned off, right? And each time I hear Neelam, I cringe. But often when I'm in a new setting, some people, especially in America, will pronounce my name Neelam, because I think it's typical to have an emphasis in the middle of your name. And I've seen many Indians whose names get butchered and they never correct them. And what I've tried to do is, in a very humorous way, I give people this anecdote that, hey, my name has a meaning and this is what it means if you pronounce it this way. And they love it. And they never, and now mine is an easier name, that's besides the point, but they never ever mispronounce it. And once the first few people get it right, then everyone else gets it right. But that way, I've always tried to maintain my own culture. I never felt I was getting lost.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because you also have this concept of bring your authentic self to work, right? And then you have this piece of, okay, how do you adapt to the cultural differences that you see? And I think the way I look at it is that when you think about the workplace and professionalism, there is an aspect of what do you need to do to make sure you're communicating effectively, you're meeting business outcomes. Then I think these are just like how you would learn a new programming language or you would learn a new tool. It's something that you're adding to your toolkit so that it can help you perform your best. And the way you can still keep your authentic self and your culture is, outside of the work setting, the language I use with others may not be the same that I'm using at a workplace. There are different facets of my personality, and depending on where I am, a part may be a little other parts.
Nice. Yeah, I like that approach of potentially separating the two things, or at least getting clear on what's effectiveness and what isn't, but also humor or being light about things, but talking about it and making sure that people pronounce your name in the right way, for example. And how
Yeah.
have you created cultural awareness and readiness within your own teams in person, but also remotely, because nowadays a lot of teams are remote?
Yeah, one of the nice things about where I work, which is Northwestern Mutual, is there is a degree of focus on diversity and inclusion, which is very welcoming. So when I approach this topic of cultural awareness, it really falls into that bucket of diversity and inclusion. Because when you think about diversity, there are different facets or so many different aspects, and cultural is one of them. Baking that into the larger goals of the company in terms of promoting a diverse and inclusive culture is one way. You put it in under the umbrella of a larger objective that the companies or the enterprise is striving towards. So some things that I have done for promoting the diversity and inclusion aspect is what we're doing right now. Like Neelam and I are really sharing our experiences with the idea that if there's awareness, then what you had touched upon earlier, Eve, where it's you may be doing some things because not because you want to be difficult or rude, but because these are the way that you've grown up. So I think some of these forums, we've done this talk at at Grace Hoppers, as well as the Northwestern Mutual Women in Tech, as well as the Global Women in Tech. So I would say that's one way of sharing your experiences, and ours may not be all encompassing, right? Like you have, as we were talking, you remembered others, and you may have several other examples that are different from ours. But I think each of us sharing that helps with that diversity as well as the inclusion aspect. And then I think common things which are very simple but very powerful, like team building events. So I always share an example where we were trying to watch like a cricket match at work because India was in the World Cup and it was like a big thing. And so one of our managers had arranged like a viewing party for us. And then we had a lot of fun because he grew up playing baseball and he couldn't for the life of him understand the game. And then later, a week later, we went to watch a baseball game and we had a lot of fun. Oh, why is he throwing the bat? Or why is he, because in baseball, you just hit and then you drop the bat. Just having those experiences where you're also doing team building, but you're also then learning about each other's culture, I think is a fun way of educating one another. Another cool thing that we have at our company is the employee resource groups. So we have different groups like the Asian ERG, Hispanic ERG, and these are great forums in a work environment where when you have holidays in different cultures, so it's a way to educate everyone of what the holiday means, maybe some dishes that you make for the holiday, maybe some kind of costumes that you wear or dresses that you wear. So again, ways of imparting that education in a fun way, which is not like monotonous. When you come to remote, yeah, it was very challenging during the COVID time because everybody was trying to figure out how do we get that sense of team building and rapport, right, when you're not together. And I think one thing that some of my team members have done really well is still having the virtual happy hours, like having once a month, you just get the team together. There's no standard topic. You're just sharing what's happening in your life. I did a few for a monthly lunch, and I thought that was a nice way for us to just connect because, especially when you're in the remote environment, you go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and sometimes you just don't have that small talk anymore. So I think it was a good way to introduce that small talk as this is what we're going to do and keep that going.
And Neelam, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I'll echo and add some things to what Anu has said. I think the ERGs have been a great way of connecting. We have a women's ERG, and I'm part of their programming committee. So we set up events from time to time. We'll bring in external speakers. This month we had our theme was emotional intelligence. So every month we have a theme. And we post in our internal Slack channel resources related to that theme. And sometimes people aren't even aware of the resources that are available. So I think the ERGs are really a great way to connect from a cultural standpoint, right? The Asian ERG, the Hispanic ERG, we learn about different cultures. And even within the women's ERG, sometimes there's women, but there's also women from different cultures. So they'll talk about how cultural differences arise on top of being a woman, right? And what being a woman of color means. So I think those are really great experiences for spreading cultural awareness. I also try to do it on a one-on-one basis, right? Sometimes if I see someone being very impatient, I'll take them aside and I'll say, hey, did you realize that person is from a different culture and this is their accent and they're trying to adapt, but it can't be halfway. You have to also make an attempt to try to understand them. So I try to do it more on a one-on-one basis, besides all the presentations.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing as well, because a lot of people coming from different cultures have a lot of insecurities around their own accent and their own communication limitations. And because they're still learning all of this, right? All these differences. One of the things as well that I thought was interesting, you shared, Anu, which is this idea of promoting one's culture in a fun way. I studied at INSEAD, and they are very international. So business school is super international, and all the different country cultures would have their own week where during the entire week they would share all about their cultures, like from the food to the dance to the festivals, but also funny things about the way they communicate or relate. And that way everybody learned a little bit more about the other cultures, but in a positive way. So I think that's wonderful that you guys do that there. And how can cultural adaptability and awareness, since you guys are really supporters of diversity, equity, inclusion, how can it help diversity, equity, inclusion, and what diversity and equity and inclusion can bring to organizations?
Yeah, I think in the recent years, this has definitely been a focus, and rightly so, because I think organizations are seeing the value that diversity brings with the different thought processes that you have, with the differences that we have. It avoids the groupthink that comes into play. And I think we're seeing it, the value of that in teams. We see it in bottom line results. And that's why you have this emphasis on diversity and inclusion right now. The other aspect of why I think this is important is that we just see the world becoming smaller and smaller, right? Like just with the internet, with Chat GPT now, or with like Neelam mentioned, offshoring, it's going to be rare that you're not going to interact with somebody who doesn't think differently, looks differently, or speaks differently from you, right? The percentage or chances of that are getting smaller as we get more and more global. So I think that's where it's really important for enterprises and organizations to embrace this, because again, if you don't communicate effectively, you may be losing a lot of time in actually getting to your outcomes. Putting some emphasis on how do you become aware of each other's differences, and then you accept and learn, and then you adapt so that you can then drive towards better results.
Yeah, I'll add to what Anu said. A lot of misunderstandings can be avoided just by understanding cultural upbringing. I remember when I was working in India, I was working for a global company, and we had some expats from Britain working with us. And there was this one male colleague. I was just a young girl, and he was about 20 years older to me. He said hi to me a couple of times when he passed me in the hallway. And I didn't say hi back because in India, it's not the norm for a female colleague to say hi. At least it wasn't in those times, right? I was a young girl. And so I remember one evening, he just burst into where I was sitting at my desk and just started telling me how rude and arrogant I was. And he made me cry. And then I'm just like, this isn't our culture here. And you had no right to come and just tell me how rude and arrogant I was. But so many such simple misunderstandings just balloon up because you don't have a good understanding of what the other person's expectation is of behavior and communication because of the culture they've been brought up in. So I think a lot of misunderstandings are removed. And as Anu said, team productivity increases, you're working cohesively, you achieve true inclusivity, which translates into bottom line results, right? So that's definitely an advantage. And then the other one is if you're a leader, right? You're able to attribute behavior of your direct reports correctly. And you're also able to guide and coach them effectively, not just those who are from a different culture, but even if some of them are from the culture that you're living in, you're able to guide them on how to interact with people from different cultures. So I think it just helps with employee well-being, which affects, the organization as a whole, helps with the bottom line results.
Oh, that's essential, having leaders that are able to give that kind of feedback. I remember you had that experience. Both of you had experiences where you were told that you were rude when you had no intention of being rude. You were actually just trying to be polite. And I had something like that as well, where I was being very quiet in meetings because I wanted to respect my superiors. I didn't think it was my role to speak in that moment. And I was thought as aloof, distant, uninterested. and just not involved. Like I was wasting people's time. I shouldn't be there because I was completely aloof and daydreaming about something else, which in reality wasn't the case. But by having a leader be able to give me that feedback and noticing what was going on, and that the expectation was that I actually did speak up, even though I was junior, that changed and shifted things for me. And I was able to avoid that label that comes with not communicating the way that's expected of us in that environment. So I can see the importance of cultural understanding in a company, not only for the individual who's moving into a new culture, but for everyone in building that connection. So this has been very interesting, very fun to hear, but also it's also a very important topic. And I appreciate you sharing your stories and sharing your perspectives and learnings around cultural communication and adaptability in the workplace.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure to be here. And as you've probably figured out, I and Anu are both passionate about this topic. We've been through the cultural assimilation journey. And what we've been trying to do, hoping we can do, is through my blog, my book, or through these presentations, is make the way easier for other folks, right? Bring that awareness of what cultural understanding really means and how it affects the workplace, and make it a better workplace for everyone.
Yeah. How about, where can the audience find you in your book, your blog post?
Sure, my LinkedIn profile would be the best place. They're all linked there. So if you just search for Neelam Mohanty, you'll find them easily.
Perfect. Thank you so much for.
I was going to say, I have my LinkedIn profile too, and it probably has a link to the Women in Tech or the Grace Hopper session we did.
Ah, beautiful. So I'll also link those below in the description box. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you.
Let me stop the